Sounds good.
It's just preparing now. Another moment or two, and then it'll be.
Sounds good.
It's just preparing now. All right, I've muted the YouTube, but I'll keep an eye on the chat there in case anybody joins there. All right, I'm going to start letting people into the webinar.
Oh, it's getting crowded in here. Woo!
Well, we had 2 people jump in right away, so that's always a good sign. So, and watch as they all filter in.
What's the weather down there in Magdalena tonight? What's
it's
it like?
As is frequent for this time of year, it's kind of breezy. The worst thing about weather in the American Southwest maybe is the very windy spring season. We can have darn near hurricane force winds blowing dust around here. But otherwise, it's a beautiful, clear day, but just a little bit breezy, and I'm grateful for what we enjoy here. The summer monsoon seasons are so dramatic in their own way that even when it's cloudy and rainy, the drama of the storms is so beautiful, they don't bum me out that much, even as an astronomer.
Yeah, cool. And I don't think you get near the tornadoes like we do over in our south central area that I'm in.
Not too many, but funny thing is, because we do have thunderstorms in New Mexico, though they're typically small cell thunderstorms compared to what to develop through like the American Midwest, we do occasionally have tornadoes just to keep it a little interesting. We do have mini tornadoes. Of course, we have dust devils, and they tend to do things like turn over picnic tables and knock over telescopes, though sometimes it's hard. Was it a dust devil that knocked over the Meade 12-inch? Or maybe it was the neighbor's steer. So the environmental concerns of different areas, that's always good for a laugh.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, John, for dark skies, Chris, all John has to do is step out of his house, basically.
It's
from
true.
downtown,
We do have pretty dark.
From downtown Magdalena.
I'm pretty.
You probably get pretty good views of the zodiacal light.
Although we have very poorly shielded lights in the village of Magdalena, which is the closest village to the Very Large Array Radio Telescope to help some people visualize where I am. The population here is only about 850 people in the village proper. So even though the lights are poorly shielded, I hate to say, though hopefully they're changing, at the right time of year, from the middle of the village, if you're shielded by nearby buildings, you see the zodiacal light go darn near up to zenith, because the altitude is about 6,500 feet and the air is dry and clear. And as long as there hasn't been a windstorm, there's not too much dust, it could be nice. So you just all feel free to come and visit, and we'll show you a good time and you can see for yourself.
I'm coming.
Right on.
We're allowed to travel again, absolutely. So it looks like our steady stream coming in the front door has dropped to a trickle. And as we're coming up on 8:35, it's probably a good time for us to start things off. So I just wanted to welcome everybody to the latest in our history speakers series. This is the 4th one we've done so far this year. We've had a quite successful run in 2021. So I'm glad that everyone's shown up. Once again, I'm Phil Groff, the Executive Director of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. And I am going to hand things off now to the chair of our history committee and the host of these speaker series, Clark Muir, who's going to introduce our special guest for the evening. Clark, take it away.
Thanks, Phil. And I also want to say hello to Randall Rosenfeld and Chris Beckett. Randall's the archivist, and Chris Beckett they're both members of the history committee, and they'll be helping with chat and some technical issues. So it's my pleasure to introduce John W. Briggs. He has lived and worked at far-ranging observatories and various technical capacities, including Mount Wilson, Yerkes, National Solar, Maria Mitchell, Venezuela National, Chamberlain, and the South Pole Station. In the 1980s, he was an assistant editor at Sky and Telescope magazine and built Bogsucker Observatory in Massachusetts. He is a member of many astronomical organizations, including the Springfield Telescope makers. They're responsible for the annual Stellafane Convention in Vermont. He currently operates FOA Observatory and the Astronomical Lyceum Museum in Magdalena, New Mexico, and serves as a board of the American Association of Variable Star Observers. John will be presenting tonight a walking tour of optical history, artifacts, and anecdotes from the Astronomical Lyceum. John, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for being here and your attention tonight. It really means a lot to be able to me to be able to share with you all tonight. And I just want to explain that the presentation is pre-recorded, and I look forward to answering any questions or sharing comments at the end. This presentation I prepared this August for SPIE, the Society of Photo-Optical Instrumentation Engineers, because I had a buddy who is a former president of the SPIE Optical Engineering Organization, who was also a former Stellafane enthusiast, and he knew about what we're doing here with this sort of eccentric astronomical Lyceum building that's stuffed with telescopes, as you'll soon see. And he appreciated the historical education that we try to do here that's very similar to what Randall is doing up there in Canada with your new telescope museum starting out. So anyway, that is why the presentation you'll hear me making reference to another speaker in the session and acknowledging SPIE people. That's because it's pre-recorded, but I think you'll enjoy it. You'll get a kick out of it if you're a fellow telescope gearhead like I am and many of us here. So if you folks there will let it rip, because my connection from New Mexico is not so hot as I hope you have there, and I will watch with you all and answer questions at the end. And thank you again for being there.
Hello, I'm John Briggs, speaking to you from Magdalena, New Mexico. And the title of this presentation is A Walking Tour of Optical History, Artifacts and Anecdotes from the Astronomical Lyceum. I'm the curator of the Lyceum, and this session has been organized thanks to the vision of SPIE, a past president, and my friend, Joe Houston. Hello, I'm John Briggs, speaking to you from Magdalena, New Mexico. And the title of this presentation is A Walking Tour of Optical History, Artifacts and Anecdotes from the Astronomical Lyceum. I'm the curator of the Lyceum, and this session has been organized thanks to the vision of SPIE, a past president, and my friend, Joe Houston, and I'm very grateful to be here. I thought I'd help set our location here. Magdalena is maybe best known for being the closest village to the Very Large Array radio telescope that's about 20 miles west of us along Route 60. This is very rural New Mexico. We have wonderfully dark skies. And by the way, this photograph was recorded by Bob Fugate, my friend, who is the other speaker in this session. Many of the best photographs in my presentation are thanks to Bob's photography. The Lyceum building was built in 1936 as a WPA project. It was originally a school theater and gymnasium, But, by about 6 years ago, it was no longer in use, and I was able to acquire it with a vision of it being shop space for working on telescopes and optical parts. I'm a semi-retired instrumentation engineer, and I've simply been nutty about telescopes all my life, having grown up as an amateur astronomer. The Lyceum is also the informal headquarters for our local astronomy club, the Magdalena Astronomical Society. And in the back, we call it the Courtyard. We have a nice observing area for visiting student groups, public viewing events, and just plain fun. Well, let me take you inside. I always feel like being a little apologetic. It's not exactly a standard museum environment. It's kind of like a warehouse, or maybe like an artist's studio, part workshop, part still lecture hall, somewhat disorganized here and there, but visitors, everybody seems to enjoy the informality of it, and perhaps they feel comfortable. There's a certain charm in the casual style, and for that I'm very grateful. There sure are a lot of telescopes. I mean, it's a little mad. It's a telescope twilight zone. But we have a lot of fun. Some of the telescopes are modern, but many are historically quite interesting, quite old. And there's a lot more here than just telescopes, as I'll illustrate as we go along. Many of the instruments were built by famous makers. Some of them are really old. This one here was made by Henry Fitz of New York City. It's a 6-inch refractor, and it was probably made about 1855. Many of these older instruments are beautifully signed. Many also are dated. I've been collecting these things over a lifetime. Surprisingly, though, many of the things you see now in this collection have actually been given to me relatively recently. I guess I don't hesitate to share my enthusiasm for this stuff, and it comes back at me in certain ways. While some of the instruments are historic, some of our equipment is quite new. This astrograph is actually used by students and visitors and friends. It's a very modern instrument. In fact, Bob Fugate, our other speaker in the session, is a particularly active user of this instrument for wide field celestial photography. Some of the telescopes are very specialized. This is a transit instrument, a semi-portable transit instrument from about 1884. It was originally at University of the Pacific. It was used for either timekeeping, or if you knew the time, you could determine the celestial coordinates of transiting stars across the local meridian. But the mechanical workmanship in this thing, made by the Fouth Company in Washington, D.C., just extraordinary, exquisite, really mind-boggling when you have a chance to look at the details of an instrument like this. Some of the instruments are professionally made, but some are amateur-made, homemade. This kind of exotic instrument is a Sheaf Speedler, an unobstructed reflector, about 4.5 inches aperture. It uses 2 spheres, but the aberrations cancel out. The image quality with a telescope like this is quite exquisite as the light kind of zigzags through it. Exotic instruments like this, of course, are a lot of fun. Some of the instruments are simply passing through the Lyceum as refurbishment projects. That's the case with this big one on the left there. It's a 9-inch refractor. It was made about 1915 by the Lohman Brothers Company in Ohio. That's me on the lower right. So beyond just displaying stuff, occasionally we are really working on stuff. We have a corner electronics lab and another corner room with a modest machine shop. Here's the 9-inch refractor leaving the Lyceum with a new paint job. We also installed a new microprocessor-controlled micro-stepped motor drive to track the stars, and it turned out very nicely. When you think about it, this instrument would have been, I guess, contemporary with something like a Model T Ford. Here's the complete telescope as recently installed only about a year ago at Roundup River Ranch in Colorado, a kids camp. This thing it's big. When pointed to zenith, that lens is 15 or 16 feet above the floor. So it was a big project, but I was very proud of it. Very proud to see a fabulous old instrument actually back in use, doing what it's made for and what it really will never wear out doing, educating people, youngsters, seeing the rings of Saturn and things of that nature. This instrument is in the Lyceum collection, and it's a future refurbishment project, but I'm showing it to you in some beautiful pictures I have as it was originally set up in the early 1950s. It was built by an amateur astronomer in California, George Carroll, but George Carroll was not your average amateur telescope maker. He was an amazingly talented man, had been very active as an early aviator, barnstorming pilot in the early 20th century. But anyway, by the 1950s, with an increasing interest in astronomy, he built this telescope at his garage as a donation to Westmont College in Santa Barbara. It's a 16-inch Newtonian Cassegrainian. David Dorkin, a historian of astronomy at the Smithsonian Institution, grew up as an amateur in California and knew George Carroll, and describes how his work became legendary among telescope makers out west. And Carroll, in fact, became a research engineer at Lockheed, and also on the side became a professional telescope maker as a home business, and is actually best remembered for his solar instrumentation. We have another 16-inch amateur-built reflector at the Lyceum. It was made just about 20 years after Carroll's 16-inch. And you see it here, and I regret the photograph doesn't begin to do it justice. I'm hoping there are some optical designers listening to this presentation who will recognize the name of Donald Dilworth. This instrument, Dilworth built as a young man in his basement in Massachusetts. It's a Dilworth relay telescope. It has all spherical optics. It's to first order, it looks like a tubeless Cassegrain, but it's not a standard Cassegrain. When Don finished this project, he brought it to a convention of amateur astronomers and telescope makers in Vermont. There was hundreds of people there over a long weekend camping out, and the telescope created a sensation. I remember, because I was there as a young teenager, the master of ceremonies pointed to this instrument and he said, someday that telescope is going to be in a museum of modern art. Well, it's here at the Lyceum now, thanks to Don's generosity. And the Lyceum is not exactly the Met in New York City, but we sure are proud to have it. Optically, by the way, the secondary mirror is actually a Mangan mirror. The reflecting surface is on the back side of a refracting element. There are also relay lenses inside the Cassegrain light baffle. And it was a design that Don simply whipped up himself. The simplicity of the tools that he had when he fabricated this in his basement was part of the astonishing story. It really was a stupendous thing. Well, at the Lyceum, we have artifacts all over the place, even hanging from the ceiling. Those big color prints on the wall, I'm proud to say, were all recorded with that modern astrograph that you saw a few images back. The big telescope hanging there on cables is actually a 13-inch refractor that was made in 1868. And of all the artifacts present here, this refractor is probably historically the most significant, but I'm going to explain that a little bit later. You know, when we got this building, we did not have running water. It took a while to restore the plumbing. This is showing the powder room that we have outside the inner restroom. On the wall of the powder room, we have a very heavy bookcase. It had to be heavy because the volumes are so weighty. It's a set of Royal Greenwich Observatory observations going back to the early 1820s. See, I'm not fooling. We're actually as proud of the library we have as we are of the instrument collection. The core of the historical library was donated by Swarthmore College. Swarthmore, until recently, had Sproul Observatory on campus that had run for a century, old-style astrometric observatory with a 24-inch refractor, but a fabulous collection of observatory publications and early journal runs. But when they shut down that observatory because they had a new facility on top of a science building, the library was up for grabs. Making the long story short, we were able to move it here and save it as a collection. And we're very proud and very grateful to have it. Now, on top of the bookcases there is yet another very unusual optical design amateur-built telescope, but it's a Schupmann medial refractor. It's a 10-inch aperture refractor. The optical design goes back to the early 20th century. It has perfect achromatic correction. It was made by Michael Maddy and James Daly, both opticians retired from MIT Lincoln Lab. And if you are interested in optical design and for some reason have not heard about the astonishing Schupmann design that offers perfect achromatic correction thanks to having another one of these Mangan correctors in the light path, well, it's possible, though not that many people necessarily know such a thing exists, as an unobstructed refractor with a single element objective, but nevertheless perfect achromatic correction at the final focus. That's what it is. Well, besides all the hardware and the library, of course, the other thing we have here are people, collaborators. Here are two fellow members of Magdalena Astronomical Society with one of the ongoing projects. They're standing with the Newtonian cage for a 37-inch telescope under construction. Behind them, in front of the bookcase, actually hanging on ropes, is the wiffle tree arrangement for supporting the 37-inch mirror. This will be a giant Dobsonian telescope being assembled in collaboration with Wheaton College of Norton, Massachusetts. But it's just another thing among the projects we have going on. Well, obviously, you're seeing that we have a lot of artifacts at the Lyceum, and we've got a nice reference library. And we're having fun. It's all volunteer, by the way. But you might ask, well, what good is coming of this? Definitely the greatest good that we can serve is occasionally when we have interested groups come and we get to share knowledge and enthusiasm with this stuff and having the show and tell artifacts. So particularly when we get student groups, physics majors, high school students and summer programs, we're getting people like that to come and visit, and they're self-selected, and it's fabulous. When we have those folks, there's a reading that I happen to have discovered. You all might notice that's A. Michelson here in this picture. There's a reading for Michelson. And of course, he was the first American to win a Nobel Prize in physics. He had a little book, Light Waves and Their Uses. Here's a reading that I think is important to share with students. Michelson wrote, "Too few is it given to combine the talent of investigation with the happy faculty of making the subject of their work interesting to others. I do not claim to be one of these fortunate few. And if I am not as successful as I wish I could be in this respect, I can only beg your indulgence for myself, but not for the subject I have chosen. This, to my mind, is one of the most fascinating, not only of the departments of science, but of human knowledge. If a poet could at the same time be a physicist, he might convey to others the pleasure, the satisfaction, almost the reverence which the subject inspires. The aesthetic side of the subject is, I confess, by no means the least attractive to me. Especially is its fascination felt in the branch which deals with light. And I hope the day may be near when a Ruskin will be found equal to the description of the beauties of coloring, the exquisite gradations of light and shade, and the intrinsic wonders of symmetrical forms and combination of forms which are encountered at every turn." It's just a fabulous quote. With Michelson's quote, we have a nice segue into this small artifact from the collection here. There on top of the stack of books, I'm sure many of you will recognize, that's a diffraction grating, a little holder. Now, of course, we couldn't always take diffraction gratings for granted. Back in the early days of spectroscopy, we didn't have spectrographs. Spectroscopy was a visual science. And this is a fabulous spectroscope from circa 1875. Look at the prism train in this instrument. It was made by John Browning in London, about 1875. It's a solar spectroscope, and it was not designed to be used mainly on the little laboratory stand that it came with. You'd separate it from the stand, and you'd attach this to a telescope. The tube going off to the right has a slit at the far end. That's where you'd focus an image of the sun. The light from the sun would be collimated and fed through this prism train, which has 4 prisms and 2 half prisms. So a total of 5 prisms of dispersion. In that thing looks kind of like a scorpion's tail. It's segmented, it's linked together. The light then was reflected back through the same prisms and would come out the bottom of the first dispersing prism it entered, and then it would enter the imaging telescope going off here at the top of this tube, an eyepiece to actually see the spectrum of the sun. And there'd be enough dispersion that if you looked at the hydrogen alpha absorption line in the red with this, with the chromosphere of the sun entering the slit, one could actually see solar prominences without the help of a total solar eclipse. The fascinating instrument, but we really don't have time to talk about it, but I just wanted to show this in contrast to that diffraction grating. Because it's the diffraction grating that I really want to talk about. Now, if you get the light just on it, you can see along the bottom of the little aperture there, looks like there's writing. Let's check it out. Now, I bet some of you have seen these old gratings and you're thinking, oh, well, he has a Rowland grating from the 1890s. Indeed, Rowland at Johns Hopkins made the best gratings in the world at that time, but this is not a Rowland. This is earlier. This is more interesting. Well, let's take a look. I've taken it apart. You can see that the grating is ruled on a blank about 2 inches square, and in fact, it's metal. It's not a glass substrate. It's speculum alloy, a mixture of copper and tin. Speculum goes back to the time of Newton, of course, even earlier, before reflecting telescopes, but it was speculum that Newton used before silver on glass optics became possible, more like 1850. Anyway, let's take a look more closely now at what the inscription actually shows. Can you read it on the bottom? Lewis M. Rutherford, New York, February 1875. Now, having flipped it 180 degrees, we can read the other side, and I think it says 5,761 lines, 8,646 or something spaces per inch. This is an early grading. Okay, who was this fellow Rutherford? Well, he was an amateur astronomer in New York City. He was quite fabulously wealthy, but he was also a fabulously creative and dedicated scientist. And he was a pioneer of celestial photography, among a lot of other things in the history of astrophysics. And for a while, he was the finest source of diffraction gratings in the world. And he became so enthusiastic about the potential of diffraction gratings for spectroscopy that he manufactured them at some small scale, but actually distributed them apparently free to spectroscopists around the world. To explain a little bit about how this happened, I happened to have bumped into a book by an astronomer named H.H. Turner, who was at Oxford University. The book, The Great Star Map, published in 1912. Let me give you a little reading. It says, Rutherford set to work to measure his photographs systematically and soon found that they recorded the positions of the stars more accurately than the best apparatus would measure them. In using a micrometer screw, he found, though he had provided himself with the best one available, that its errors were sufficiently large to prevent his doing justice to the photographs. He therefore turned aside from his original project to the construction of a better screw, and ultimately made a screw so accurate that his attention was again distracted towards the completest possible test of its accuracy. This he found in the ruling of very fine lines close together on metal, several thousands within an inch, the result being what is called a grating, which can be used like a prism to spread the light out into a spectrum. This work was so engrossing that Rutherford never seriously returned to his original purpose of measuring star photographs, but many of his have since been measured. This right here is one of these screw-enabled devices called a measuring engine. This one was not made by Rutherford. It was made by the Gertner Company, William Gertner in Chicago, and it was actually the original measuring engine at Van Vleck Observatory in Connecticut, and it was used to measure celestial photographs to determine the parallax shifts of stars as the Earth goes around the sun. The stars most nearby us shift a little bit, of course, and that's the first step in the cosmic distance ladder. But however, to measure the photographs accurately enough to do this, you'd need fabulous machinery. And that's what Rutherford pioneered, but discovered the potential of diffraction gratings along the way. Meanwhile, his celestial photography was most highly respected. Now, finally, I can return to the telescope hanging from the building, because it turns out this was the Rutherford Telescope. This is the instrument that Lewis used to record photographs of the sun, the moon, star clusters before the motions of stars had ever been measured by photography before. This was ultimately donated to Columbia University, where Rutherford was on the board of directors, and it was used into the 1930s for ongoing astrometric observations. Among the things Rutherford did, he was the first person to publish a spectral sequence of stellar spectral types. His was a very simple one, and he didn't pursue stellar spectroscopy very far, but he was actually the first to publish such a thing. Another thing, even less well remembered, Rutherford, with this telescope, was the first person to photograph solar granulation. But a lot of historians of solar physics didn't acknowledge Rutherford's priority in this for historical reasons. I can't go into the details right now. But I was very lucky to have as a friend Dr. Jack Harvey of National Solar Observatory. He knew we had the Rutherford Telescope. Jack proposed we take it to Kitt Peak National Solar Observatory outside Tucson and take it into the McMath Solar Telescope Laboratory behind us there. That was the most convenient way to take the unmounted old refractor and illuminate it with a sunbeam and then see what we could get. Could we reenact Rutherford's claimed priority photographing the solar granulation in the 1870s? Well, the proof's in the pudding. Here's an image from our observing run. Now, of course, we had everything going for us in terms of a modern camera, an electronic detector, good seeing at Kitt Peak. But obviously, the 13-inch lens from 1868 still works great. Fabulous lens. The granules, the convection cells in the apparent surface of the sun, the solar photosphere, each of them is about 2 arc seconds in diameter, and they have a lifetime of just a few minutes. The dark spot pair down the lower right, a solar physicist wouldn't call that a sunspot. It's too small at this image scale. It'd be called a pore. So we had a lot of fun publishing the results, reenacting Rutherford's observation of solar granulation with the original telescope, and it was absolutely no problemo. Well, stuff around the Lyceum goes on and on. Let's take a look at this observatory refractor with a 5-inch lens. Now, the thing I usually highlight most about this instrument is it was used by Clyde Tombaugh, the discoverer of Pluto, early in his teaching career at New Mexico State University. However, the telescope dates back to more like 1910, long before Clyde's time. There's a plaque on it that identifies the maker, a Paris-born optician named Petit. But by the time this telescope was made, again, circa 1910, I think, Petit was operating out of Chicago. What's interesting about Petit goes back to the reference to Michelson earlier. Most people think of Michelson and the Michelson-Morley experiment, so famous in the history of modern physics. Guess who made the optics in the interferometer for Michelson's Michelson-Morley experiment? Petit. So if we have advanced students visiting the Lyceum, advanced enough to be intrigued with the Michelson-Morley experiment, how cool it is to be able to point this artifact out to them. Now, of course, what we'd like to be able to do is have this telescope set up outdoors, so as we have visiting students and tell them the story of Michelson, who he was, the experiment, at the same time actually using this telescope to do something like look at the rings of Saturn, well, that's a way to make it really hands-on and quite a memorable lesson in the history of physics. Okay, my abstract for this presentation was maybe a little grandiose. I made reference to certain ascendancies. Let's try to finally deal with that stuff. This picture shows several cool refracting telescopes. They have in common that they were all made by a family in Massachusetts, Elvin Clark and Sons. Let's see. This one here, it's a 5-inch, was made in 1875. This one here is a 6-inch refractor made 1884. This one here is only a 3.5-inch. It turned up on eBay recently, but it is 1869. All of these were made by Elvin Clark and Sons, a family that began experimenting with telescope making in the Boston area in 1844. Their telescopes progressed quickly in excellence, but American astronomers in the mid-19th century could not quite believe that good telescopes could be purchased locally without importing them from Europe. Eventually, the family sold a telescope to a fellow in England, Reverend William Dawes, a very famous double star observer. Dawes admired the telescope so well that he publicized his satisfaction of it in English astronomical journals. And Dawes was so highly respected when American astronomers saw the Clark telescopes recommended abroad, they began to pay attention to Elvin Clark. So the Clark instruments were superb. And the proof of that was that altogether 5 times the family came to build the largest successful refracting telescope in the world. And their more common telescopes were signed like this one. It reads Elvin Clark and Sons, Cambridgeport, Massachusetts, 1895. Very beautifully engraved. There is a certain almost irrational exuberance for Clark telescopes among collectors. These things are like the Stradivarius of telescopes among collectors. But it was justified. And their pride of workmanship, of course, is evident in how they chose to sign them. Now, by the way, 1895 was just 3 years before the dedication of their greatest accomplishment, the 40-inch refractor for University of Chicago, dedicated 1897. Let's now talk a little bit about the ascendancy of American astrophysics. It was enabled by early American optical engineering, but so much of it was due to one man, to one astronomer, pioneering astrophysicist, George Ellery Hale, seen here at the spectrograph head of the 60-foot solar telescope at Mount Wilson Observatory, of which he was the founding director. But before Mount Wilson, Hale, as a young man, was the founding director also of this observatory, Yerkes Observatory of University of Chicago. This is one of my favorite old-time pictures of the place. Check out the houses. Behind the trees in the extreme right side, that house, it was originally home of famous American astronomer E.E. Barnard. The house in the far distance, just to the right of the observatory, looks like a farmhouse. That was the home for many decades of the famous stellar spectroscopist William Morgan. More recently, the home behind the trees was used by Nobel Prize-winning astrophysicist Chandrasekhar, otherwise known around the observatory as Chandra. So Yerkes came to have a fabulous history, way beyond what we can describe now. But in its beginning, it was due to Hale, and it was due to the availability of a 40-inch objective made by Elvin Clark and Sons family. So many things flowed from Yerkes Observatory. You have to see it. You have to visit and see it to appreciate it, to believe it. What a lot of ornamentation, huh? You might wonder, was so much of that necessary? Who can tell? It was certainly inspirational to the people who were there. They meant business. You step inside Yerkes Observatory, and there's obviously no question that they built it to be a great and significant place. Long after Hale had left Yerkes for projects in California, he returned for what proved to be his last visit there. But he was in the company of a younger astronomer who recorded what happened. Hale was always in a hurry, and this time was no exception. He was late for a train. He came into Yerkes, he spoke with the director there, and had to rush out to catch a train back to Chicago. He was out the door, but realized he hadn't taken the time to step up and simply look at the 40-inch refractor. So he turned around. He went back up in the building and ran up to the top of the stairs and went through the door down there where those visitors are. And he looked up at the telescope for a few moments and simply he uttered, "Noble instrument." And then he ran out and caught his train. Here's a rare photograph although it's on the internet now and you can find it, but what it shows is the Yerkes lens and cell being worked on in the Alvin Clark and Sons factory in Cambridgeport, Massachusetts. Now, by the time this lens was made in the 1890s, Alvin and one of his two sons had passed away. The surviving son was Alvin Graham Clark. But he, in the late 1890s, was already quite elderly. So the optician actually most responsible for this lens was a fellow named Carroll Lundin. Working with Carroll was his son Robert. The young man on the left in this shot is Robert Lundin. He lived into the 1960s, and I heard a lot about him. And eventually I found out that his daughter was living in Austin, Texas. And I wrote to her in the early 1980s. And I told her how I was interested in her family's optical history. She wrote back to me. She said, "Dear Mr. Briggs, you brought back memories I haven't thought of in very long. My father worked long hours and didn't talk that much about work." I'm paraphrasing my memory of her letter. But she also said, "You know, I have some things in the scrapbook. I have no one to give them to. And if you're interested, well, here they are." That's how I got this photograph. Until then, there hadn't been anything surviving known quite like this. So it's of course it's exciting to have it. Here's one of my favorite contemporary photographs of the Yerkes scope. It's showing solar physicist Steve Tomczyk of Colorado's High Altitude Observatory. He was visiting to take detailed measurements and undertake a optical study of the Yerkes 40-inch. He's very interested in it because he anticipates soon, he hopes, building a 60-inch single element refractor as a solar chronograph and mounting it at high altitude in Hawaii. So many astronomy textbooks describe the big refractors as dinosaurs and dead. Nevertheless, if you talk to certain solar physicists, the idea of even larger lenses to enable very low scattered light observations is still something quite desirable to be considered for the future. So there was a fabulous ascendancy of American astrophysics in the later 1800s and, of course, through the 20th century. And Yerkes Observatory was just a stepping stone, but it was a stepping stone towards Mount Wilson. Here's the 60-inch reflector at Mount Wilson. Many people consider it the grandfather of all modern reflectors. The mirror to this telescope was begun in the basement of Yerkes Observatory. The blank for it was purchased by Hales' father and imported from France. And that's actually me there as a younger man. I worked there as an observer in the 1980s, and I'm proud to have had that experience. Funny thing is that for all of George Ellery Hales' accomplishments, having been the founding director of Yerkes Observatory, the founding director of Mount Wilson Observatory, the discoverer of magnetic field associated with sunspots, arguably his greatest scientific discovery, he's probably popularly not remembered for any of those things as much as he is for the 200-inch telescope at Palomar that was named in his honor, because he was the visionary driving force for this project as well, although he did not live to see it completed. Isn't this a nice drawing by the architect? doesn't the architecture just exude the monumental vision they had creating this facility? Now, although we've got all the way up to Palomar Observatory, I want to take one other quick aside, and that is, you might wonder, well, how did I get so interested in this arcane stuff? Well, one of the factors was that as a young teenager, starting in 1973, I attended this convention as a young kid. This is the Stellafane Convention in Springfield, Vermont. And this, in fact, is the same convention where I first saw Don Dilworth and his telescope. This event has been running annually since the 1920s, and nowadays typically draws about 1,000 people. It is a fabulous experience for a youngster interested in science to come and discover what a strong community of interest that exists in subjects like this. Otherwise, you wouldn't even know as a kid in school. We don't have time here to talk about the charming pink clubhouse and the very unusual turret telescope observatory built in the 1920s. This shot shows the crowd gathered for the main lecture in 2012. But Stellafane is a kind of experience that, as a young person, when you attend it, it can become more important than Christmas. It's so exciting, so interesting. The opportunities you have to see and do things and engage with nature. As you might guess, there was a visionary responsible for building the Stellafane Observatory and initiating the convention that continues to influence the lives of so many thousands of people. His name was Russell W. Porter, and as a young man, he'd been an Arctic explorer, but he was an amazing Renaissance character. He could do so many different things. He saw a telescope in action on Boston Common as a young man, looked through it by paying a nickel or something, found the view so engaging that he had to have a telescope of his own, but he didn't have much money. He had been a student at MIT. So he simply made his own telescope. He ground his own reflecting telescope. He wrote up the work in popular magazines, and it drew the attention of an editor at Scientific American, who consequently gave Russell Porter and the activities at Stellafane considerable national publicity. Russell Porter's broad talents came to the attention of George Ellery Hale, and Hale recruited him to join the team at Caltech designing and building the 200-inch telescope. So Porter consequently spent the final years of his life out in California, closely associated with Hale. And what Porter became most famous for were the extraordinary drawings that he created of the 200-inch telescope and Palomar Observatory. I think every one of these drawings has a human figure or more somewhere in it. What we're going to do is I'm going to quickly and silently go through a few of these, and you can play Where's Waldo if you want, looking for the people for a sense of human scale. Whoa, hey, wait. How'd this get in here? Oh, it's okay. No, this is supposed to be in here. Okay. Um, Let me explain. There was another artist, friend of Russell Porter, named Maxfield Parrish. He was incredibly popular back in the mid 20th century. My sister-in-law collects Maxfield Parrish prints. Is still well remembered for this sort of thing. Well, Parrish and Porter were friends. Parrish was aware of those cutaway drawings of the 200-inch. This is what Parrish had to say about them. If these drawings had been made from the telescope and its machinery after it had been erected, they would have been of exceptional excellence, giving an uncanny sense of reality, with shadows accurately cast and well-nigh perfect perspective. But to think that any artist had his pictorial imagination in such working order as to construct these pictures with no other mechanical data than blueprints of plans and elevation of the various intricate forms is simply beyond belief. These drawings should be in a government museum as standards, in a glass case, along with the platinum pound weight, yardstick, etc., to show the world and what comes after just what a mechanical drawing should be. Not only that, but the rendering is a work of art, exact and lifelike, and done with a delightful freedom of technique. I doubt if there are drawings anywhere which can in any way compare with these for perfection in showing what a stupendous piece of machinery is going to look like when finished. Their creation should be world news. Maxfield Parrish. Right on, Maxfield. Okay. The Lyceum doesn't have original copies of any of these Porter drawings. We're seeing them now through the courtesy of Caltech archives. You can find images on the internet easily enough. This one here is a little bit less finished. It's now recognized that this drawing was the one Porter was working on when he passed away. It was still on his desk. It's showing the Coudet spectrograph of the 200-inch telescope. The spectrograph room is really the deepest inner sanctum of an observatory like that. Fabulously intricate. Now, folks familiar with modern optics, clean rooms, Newport tables, we can take these intricate environments more for granted today. But in the early 20th century, for example, the one at the 100-inch at Mount Wilson, there weren't so many examples of these kinds of places as there are now. So they're quite extraordinary to visit and to see, especially back in the day. Well, let's see. I'm going to try to point out that here, see, there's a grating holder. And because the grating was the heart of the whole apparatus, arguably the heart of the entire observatory, Porter chose to bring out the grating mechanism and its rotary table here. And notice there's the handle there too. That's what he was working to highlight in this drawing, because after all, this was the real inner sanctum. It was the instrumental mecca. The grating itself was like the meteoritic stone. Well, just to bring us back to reality, here's an image showing astronomer Horace Babcock there with the apparatus, and there's the grating table that Porter had highlighted. This image courtesy of Huntington Library in Pasadena. Well, we've spent a lot of time talking about Russell Porter and his famous cutaway drawings of the 200-inch, even though I don't have any originals of those drawings at the Lyceum. But there's some method to my madness, because the Lyceum is something of an archive. So let me tell you the story. There was a young Navy-trained optician working at Caltech on optics for the 200-inch. I believe, actually, they're optics related to that Coudet room. And Chester knew Russell Porter and went to visit him. And Chester expressed interest in mechanical drawing, and it was also quite clear that Chester Silvernail hoped to get a memento from Porter, who was famous for being able to improvise fabulous sketches of anything right on the spot. Porter replied to the young man, well, you know, instead of just giving you another drawing, how about I give you a lesson? So the result was this document, and we have it at the Lyceum. And that's because Chester, he went on to become a professor of astronomy at San Diego State and many other projects, and ultimately a senior optical engineer at Los Alamos. Also along the way, Chester became friends with Gene Cross. I bet many people listening to this know Gene Cross, optical engineer, senior optical engineer in California. Chester gave his papers to Gene Cross. Gene Cross recently gave a lot of his papers to the Lyceum. That's how I discovered the Silvernail collection among Gene's papers, including this little document here. To find the vanishing point of any system of parallel lines. Well, you can follow it along, and there it is, signed with the initials of Russell W. Porter, June 1947. But as a fellow telescope nut and appreciative person of Porter's genius, I'm very proud that this document survives safely. Okay, after all this talk, there is a test I'm inflicting upon you, especially if you ever want to come and visit the Lyceum. And the test is, you have to look at these two images of me, then and now. If you can correctly identify then versus now, you're welcome to come visit the Lyceum. Sure hope you do someday. But if you do, don't take it out on me if you break your foot on this artifact basically in the entryway of the facility, in the corner. It's quite immobile without an engine hoist. And if you do come and you're curious about this artifact, maybe I'll tell you the story of how it happens to be here and how we aspire to refurbish it along with a lot of other things, and how crazily it came to pass to be part of the collection. With that little mystery in mind, thank you very much for your attention during this presentation.
Again, if you can hear me, thank you very much for your attention in this all too long presentation, but I hope you all found it amusing, those of you who stuck it out to the very end. Are there any comments or questions anybody would like to share?
I think there's a question in the chat there from Brad Schaefer asking, and I also had this question: how many Alvin Clark telescopes do you have there?
It's Brad. It's so nice to hear from Brad. I don't know off the top of my head, and part of the problem is that, you know, when it comes to these sorts of things, and you're compulsively interested in these things, you tend to take whatever you can get. And so sometimes you only get a fragment. Sometimes you might have a tube assembly that has no lens, but it's still neat. Or you might have a lens that, by the nature of the construction of the lens cell, that you know that it came from the Clark Corporation, but that's all you have. So I have enough artifacts like that to confuse a trivial count. But unfortunately, I have owned other Clark telescopes over my time that I no longer have in the collection, because I have not been able to afford to keep all of those that I found in my youth, having become a married guy and having needed a down payment on a house once in a while, or needed to buy a car when my wife had the first baby. You're inclined to cash something in once in a while, but I have got to admit, I still have enough of them lying around in racks to be satisfied. And we walking through the Lyceum, we could probably point to maybe a half a dozen Elvin Clark tube assemblies pretty easily, sitting around in various states. But there are a lot more artifacts, but I guess I've said enough about all that to give you some impression.
I sort of have a question to kind of build on that, and that is, it looks like you're collecting some, you're refurbishing some. So, for example, that 3-inch one that you recently were able to get off eBay, is there a plan for that one to I mean, that just looks like such a beautiful little instrument as a small telescopic observer. It seems like a shame not to pick a few of the little ones to refurbish.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, I'm embarrassed by many personal aspects of the unfinished projects around the Lyceum rank high among the embarrassments. Of course, some people will argue that, you shouldn't you shouldn't mess with the antique patina and all this kind of stuff. So it depends. I am not necessarily a purist in that regard, because I have experienced instruments, for example, that were quite clearly turned into the Clark company, and they were refurbished as secondhand instruments. Naturally, that was not terribly uncommon to have happened. And you could tell that there might be a complete 4-inch refractor dated from the 1880s, say, but very beautifully mounted right into the original storage chest is a Clark Corporation accessory from like the 1920s. My interpretation of that phenomenon, combined with the fact that the telescope from the 1880s has a rather beautiful, new-looking lacquer finish, because it hasn't been used very much. My interpretation of that kind of situation is that telescope went back to the Clark Corporation in the 1920s. They refurbished it, and they included like a modern star diagonal or terrestrial eyepiece that's labeled and all that. So in other words, my point is that the Clark Corporation themselves was not shy about refurbishing instruments to try to preserve their appearance as reasonably made. So therefore, it is not necessarily wrong to refurbish some of these instruments now. However, to do it right, it's terribly time consuming, and you've got to be careful. And some of the things that I know a little bit about how to do today, I must admit to you all, I've learned the hard way. So what I've found is that there are so many instruments, artifacts, even like libraries, that are being neglected. There are so many orphan things, cool things that we as professional or amateur or just as astronomers, just as people interested in astronomy, so many things are orphaned and neglected, but have tremendous inspirational and educational potential. There are a lot of things need to be saved. And sometimes, in my opinion, it's been more important to take action saving things. And I don't mean necessarily buying them on eBay. There are things out there that are destined for a wrecking ball or destined for a dump. I could tell stories, but I don't want to. I don't want to embarrass too many other people. So my time has been prioritized, maybe more with salvage than refurbishment. But I gotta agree with you, man. I would wait if I could show you the inscription on that 1869. Some of them have inscriptions that are even more beautiful than others because they're big and bold. And that particular 3.5-inch 1869, man, it's got a nice inscription just begging to be appropriately cleaned, properly polished and relacquered. But I haven't got around to doing it yet, and I apologize.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're forgiven on that one for sure. It just, for that one, it just seems like a beautiful telescope that somebody could be using. Like,
oh yeah,
yeah, you know.
Well, it's like, parents sometimes make jokes about the children and like which one do they love best, or which one would they cash in first? They're naughty or something. We can have the same enthusiasm for these telescopes too, and these artifacts. So it's a hard choice, but part of what my friends and I are doing here in rural New Mexico, we are really trying to encourage people to come out our way. A lot of people are choosing to retire to more rural areas, and we have had a nice influx of people here in Magdalena lately, in the general region too, who are interested in astronomy. The more such people we have here, having fun together, the better we can argue for dark skies, the better we can attempt to rationalize our fundamental insanity, on and on and on. So some of these projects I expect will have to wait for others as we get a bigger community of collaborators here, but that's really what it's all about.
Nice. We have another question here. Sorry, I love seeing the telescopes. I really want to come down there and see this place. I have about a third of what's in your museum in my closet downstairs, I think. So we have a question here from Brad Schaefer. How many iris diaphragm photometers do you have, and how many are still existing in the wild?
If only I were the knower of all things, I could answer that second question. And I do, iris diaphragm photometers, such as were designed and sold by an astronomer named Cuffey. Brad knows about these because, let's see, Brad and I collaborated to get one of these photometric instruments, these instruments to facilitate photographic photometry, contributed to a museum at Yale. And one of these instruments was at Van Vleck Observatory, and I knew about it. I knew it was destined for the dumpster, but it was just too cool. And somehow we got it to a collection at Yale, and to where it presumably still sits. Because see, this was before I had the Lyceum space. And if I do know, I'll tell you this, I don't know where all the other ones are, but Brad, I just found out there is one other one neglected at University of Oklahoma. So poor University of Oklahoma is in my crosshairs to get a photographic photometry iris photometer, just what I need, don't I, in the Lyceum collection to trip over. But these kinds of things go on and on. Some of these things are very arcane, but you can link them together in interesting ways, I think, telling stories about the history of astronomical technology and all that. And people like us tolerate such stories. At least I like to think so.
Okay, John, we've got you here, and you've put the bait on the end of the hook. So tell us about that. You gave us this nice long story, Russell Porter's last drawing before he dropped. and you showed us the stuff from that student who helped there, but by giving him that lesson in mechanical drawing, that connects with that artifact you didn't tell us about.
Your voice was breaking up a little bit in the transmission, but you're talking about the document that Porter.
Well, I'm talking about you said anyone who comes there and manages to stub their toe or not.
Oh,
yeah. So give us the story, John.
Okay. So of course the artifact that I sort of in a silly way talking around there, it happens that I have in the collection. In the entryway where you could, if you weren't careful, you could trip over it, though it is in the corner. I actually have the original grating holder from the Coudet room of the Palomar 200-inch telescope. And as Porter had drawn it, he tried to pull it out in the drawing and actually show it twice, once in scale, buried there in the image of the Coudet optical layout, but then closer to the viewer, there was the drawing of this darn thing. Well, I've got the darn thing. So the deal was maybe 20 or 25 years ago, the people at Palomar decided to replace that manually cranked grating holder with a computer-controlled rotary table so they could easily and remotely change the grating angle. At least I presume that's what motivated them. But instead of putting, a stepper motor or something with an index and absolute encoder on the original table that Porter had so beautifully drawn, they just took the whole thing out and they put a new rotary table, like an off-the-shelf thing out of the McMaster car catalog or something, and they put it in there. But one of the technicians at Palomar could not bear to throw something that cool out. But I'm talking, this thing is heavy. And so he had to put it in the garage down in San Diego of his stepfather's house or something, where it sat for another 10 years. And finally, the house had to be sold by the family. And by then I had met the guy, and I was working at Apache Point Observatory at the time, and he knew I was a nut for this stuff. And so he told me about it. Said, John, if you want to come out, if you can move that thing and get it out of the garage, the family's selling the house, you can have it. So I got the thing and I had it in storage for a good 10, 15 years or something like that before I happened to acquire the Lyceum building that allows me to put it out there as an impediment for you all when you come to visit and to make silly stories about it. But when you think about the people who have actually had their hand on the handle of that rotary table and worked in the Coudet room of the Palomar 200-inch Hales telescope, it's just pretty cool. So that's yet another artifact that really deserves to be cleaned up, elevated off the floor, put on a very stout table, and have put a grating in it and sort of show it off. But opportunities like that, of course, go on and on and on.
Well, what some of you don't know is John has already cleared the space for the HST when he can get a hold of it.
Yeah. With my luck, it'll come barreling down through the atmosphere and land right on top of Magdalena and take out some of the street lights.
Of all the things you know about and are possible to get, what is it which you don't have at the moment, but what is it that you would most like to have?
Well, actually, to try to answer that question a little seriously, though I much prefer to answer ridiculously, what I really do need here, I need roll-off roof observatory space, because it's an obscenity to have so many things already that are simply lying there as you see them. So it's not so much a need for more artifacts as a wish I could be doing better, offering opportunities for people to experience these things and for me to enjoy these things too under the stars. But it's expensive, even building small roll-off roof observatories. But my friends and I are working in that direction. But I tell you, I do not lust for too much more stuff. I mean, things come up that are cool. And I do have some, I will say this, I have some exciting irons in the fire. I believe I'm going to be adding some artifacts in the future, in the near future, I hope, both big and small, that will be fun to talk about, but I can't really talk about them yet. And there's always, it's surprising how much of this stuff is out there, orphaned. And I fear that enough so that I'm not really desiring for more stuff, but when I hear about stuff, I got to admit, I do lust for things sometimes when I hear about them. And maybe it's just the phase of life and I have no other options. But that's, I'll tell you more about happy things when they arise, so to speak.
I guess a better question would be, what are the most memorable surprises you've had? Stuff you didn't expect would survive, and all of a sudden there it was.
Boy. One does have surprises. Certainly that Porter drawing was a wonderful surprise, going through the papers of Gene Cross. It was also a wonderful surprise because this friend, who's since passed away, optical engineer Gene Cross, he had collected a lot of stuff over his life, and he dumped it all on me. I discovered in his collection glass plates that had originally been the property of none other than George Ritchie.
Good God.
Yeah, 8 by 10 inch glass plates, including some of the what I believe is the 60-inch grinding machine. I'm really quite certain, including Ritchie himself in the field of view of the image. And there are very few, if any, published images of Ritchie actually beside the grinding machine or machines, 60-inch or 100-inch or 40-inch for U.S. Naval Observatory. There aren't that many pictures. Usually they just put a chair beside the machine, you remember, right?
Yep.
And all his buddies at Mount Wilson and Yerkes, they always had a chair in there for scale, and it was cool. It was an anonymous way to show off how cool everything was without showering attention too much on any one individual, like Ritchie. Well, I got a plate that I believe shows Ritchie. That was a surprise. So things like that come up. I think there are, one thing I ought to try to say as I babble on here, in my opinion, there are important opportunities for all of us in our astronomical interest to work, to be aware and conscious of opportunities for historical preservation. It's simply another realm of astronomy, whether you want to consider yourself an amateur or a professional or engage whatever level is convenient and possible for you in your life. But all around us, it might be just a local observatory at a school. There are many things that simply need engagement by people that care. Sometimes these opportunities are dramatically historical, but sometimes maybe less immediate, obviously historical. But I've become big on what I might rationalize as historical preservation. And I do believe opportunities for engagement abound, and people should consider that as really yet another realm of astronomy in which to engage. The late Don Osterbrock said to me once privately and with encouragement, he said, "John, remember that history of astronomy is astronomy too." And, I was not a mathematical moron, but I was not mathematically gifted like a Chandrasekhar so as to naturally become a theoretical astrophysicist. You don't have to be a theoretical astrophysicist to contribute to astronomy. George Ellery Hale was much more, I think, a man of words than he was a man of numbers. That's just my interpretation. Historians can engage. The fellow who wrote so many history books, he was a retired newspaperman related to Lowell Observatory. What was his name? Graves? Oh, man, I've got a mental block.
Hoyt.
Hoyt. Yeah, of course, Hoyt. Thank you, Randall. what fabulous histories he wrote in his later years, in the same way that Don Osterbrock, Professor Osterbrock, former director of Lick Observatory, chose to devote so much of his attention to history and writing wonderful books in his later years. Well, these are opportunities that ought to inspire many people.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I suppose the outstanding example would be Faraday, of the person who, I mean, it's all a matter of context. You can ask people who've gotten Nobel Prizes, and they'll say, well, I'm not, Roger Penrose would say he's not a very good mathematician. And he has to approach it by thinking of these things visually, and Feynman too. But of course, we look at the outside and think, yeah, right, I wish I was that good, a not good mathematician.
Yeah, yeah.
I suppose Faraday is the poster child for that.
That's right. Well, hey, folks, you know, I tell you something, I hate to say this, but it turns out I have another obligation this evening, a similar Zoom event that I am nervous may have begun 2 minutes ago.
Good God.
So, but it's a more casual affair. I could not overemphasize my gratitude being able to share with you all. It's really a big deal to me. So thank you for your attention. And I hope I can continue to listen in on your historical program coming out of Canada. What a nice thing. And thank you all, but I better go because I got to check my time zone on this other gig.
Thanks, John.
Thank you so much for being here, John.
And email me. Oh, by the way, this presentation is online, and and already, you know, and all that kind of stuff. Please feel free always to distribute my email for follow-up questions and all that jazz. But on that note, I better cut out. So thanks again.
And thanks, John, for joining us.
See you later, guys. See everybody.
It was a treat. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I should emphasize what I think John already implied. If any of you are thinking of going down in the Southwest, just drop John a note, and he'd wouldn't describe let you loose, but you get into the Lyceum to poke around. That was a lot of fun.
Well, we've done 6 of these so far, and 3 of our speakers have been from the American Southwest. So there's something going on down there.
Absolutely.
So
definite RASC road trip in the offing.
Yeah. I guess we should probably just wrap it up. I was glad I was able to say thanks for his presentation, but obviously not in the way I'd wanted to. But I don't know what we're going to do next month, but that one will be hard to top, I think. Anyways, it's a good problem to have. So I guess if there's any closing remarks from Chris and Randall, I'll throw it over to Phil to say goodnight.
Anything from Chris, Randall? No?
Oh, I guess that's it.
Okay, then I will just say thanks once again, everyone, for coming out this evening. As always, this talk will be up reasonably in perpetuity on our YouTube page. We should get it fully edited and such with appropriate thumbnails and such shortly, but it will be live right after this is concluded. So if you don't mind looking at unedited footage, it will be there. And yes, we don't know what's coming up next, but stay tuned. A lot of exciting talks, I'm sure, over the rest of the year. And of course, just to tease a little bit here, we do have some amazing talks that are being planned for this year's GA coming up at the end of June. So look for the first official announcements about that coming out shortly. So
thanks everybody for attending. It was a pleasure to do.